Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here as we start off an incredible project for us, our concert and conference, Music and Justice. We're so glad to have you. And we thought to begin to hear this incredible work, to set the stage for Music and Justice, that we would have this pre-concert talk. We have a very, very unique panel of individuals who will be brought out momentarily. We prepared for you today a very special documentary that talks about the work, The Gates of Justice by Dave Brubeck, that's going to set the tone for how we're framing music and justice. So this particular film includes footage that was done by the Milken Archive about 20 years ago in 2003 with Dave and Iola Brubeck, and we've also updated it with very recent footage of individuals who will be a part of our program both today and tomorrow. So with no further ado, you'll see a very wonderful video that just lasts about 7 minutes. Thank you.
The idea for this piece was essentially to bring together and bring back together the Black and Jewish communities at the end of the civil rights movement.
The 60s, especially by 1969, I just think of it as an explosive, volatile time where King, for example, really saw love and brotherhood, but also integration and access as goals that were worthwhile and attainable. Some began to wonder if the road we were going down could possibly ever be successful.
At this point in our history, there was a lot of friction in the communities.
A feeling of hostility where once they had worked together for civil rights and felt that they had a common understanding, a common cause, and that was being fragmented at that time.
By the late 1960s, Dave Brubeck really felt that civilization was in crisis, and he needed to become involved in a much more direct way.
Brubeck writes Gates of Justice as a kind of a call to find our better selves. So I find it not accidental that in the midst of all of this unrest, he writes this piece that at the center of it is the idea of justice and God.
The Gates of Justice is a cantata. It's in 12 movements, and it features two soloists. We have one tenor soloist, who is typically a Jewish cantor-style singer, and then we have a baritone soloist whose line has a lot of blues-inflected notes and was originally written for a Black baritone to sing. The role of the baritone was to sort of take these texts that are coming from the Bible, that are coming from Hillel, from Martin Luther King Jr., from spirituals, to take these texts and really make them applicable to modern day life and make the audience think kind of self-reflectively.
And so he uses the cantoral traditions as well as traditions from the spirituals and from the blues and jazz, and he kind of puts them all in the pot together for really a very, very interesting, I think, kind of synthesis of different cultural traditions.
Movement 10, Brubeck is really playing with juxtaposition. You hear all of these very different styles of music just slammed right up next to each other. He is showing the strengths of multiculturalism, of what happens when we can bring together different musical traditions into the same piece.
Brubeck wasn't simply trying to express kind of Black traditions through jazz and gospel and blues. If you look at the whole of the Gates of Justice, there are references to Latin American traditions, there are references to classical 20th century composing techniques, and I think that goes to his larger goal that we are one people. Our power is understanding that oneness, and I think he literally wrote it into the music.
I think the most moving part of Gates of Justice is movement 5. where the baritone is singing, "Lord, when will the ill winds change? Lord, what will tomorrow bring?" It's really a questioning movement. There's something sort of undescribable about the emotional effect that it has.
We had a friend from New Orleans that when things got tough, she'd say, "Lord, Lord, what will tomorrow bring?" And so I said that. And Iola added, "Today I felt an arrow stinging in a wound so deep my eyes refused to weep." What will tomorrow bring?
The choir in Gates of Justice plays a really important role. They are referred to by Brubeck as the choir of unheard millions. So they're a little bit like a backdrop or like a Greek chorus. It's sort of where the audience is meant to imagine themselves and to picture the choir and therefore sort of be part of the work itself.
My father and mother had a very deep social conscience, and racial prejudice and ethnic prejudice has no place in the universe of justice, which is part of the reason why it's called the Gates of Justice. They wanted to create a piece that would make people think about that and hopefully move everyone closer to that goal.
I think the message of love and brotherhood is always relevant, that truth and justice doesn't have to happen in the streets with someone with a fist up. One can promote the idea of love, brotherhood, and justice and social justice on the concert stage.
We're at a time when this world could disappear on us unless we really get down to believing in the original meaning of all the great religions and the brotherhood of man, and realizing that man is good.
So our thanks to the Lowell Milken Family Foundation Creative Services team for putting this film together, dealing with footage that's a little bit older and creating a lot of newer footage. We're very, very grateful for their work, for the video of this video and the video that you'll see later on this evening. So you could hear how prophetic Dave Brubeck's words are about the fragility of our world. And unfortunately, the issues of hate are part of the common discourse and news of today. So this work has super relevance and importance today. I want to just acknowledge two people who are in the film who might be here. Is Dwight Andrews here? Yes, hi Dwight. So Dwight will be, thank you Dwight. Dwight will be joining us tomorrow for our conference. And Kelsey Klotz, is Kelsey here? Maybe Kelsey's still on her way in. And Chris Brubeck, I think, is Chris here? Yeah, so thank you to the three of them. So thank you all very much. So today's panel now, pre-concert talk, is a very distinguished group of individuals. I'd like to introduce them to come out on stage, to Wayne Winborne, and to Darius Brubeck, Larry Blumenfeld, and to Arturo O'Farrill. And while they're taking their seats, it's my pleasure to do the introductions to Wayne Winborne, who will be our moderator. Wayne is the executive director of the Institute of Jazz Studies at Rutgers University in Newark, the largest and most comprehensive archive and library of jazz and jazz-related materials in the world. Wayne is also an assistant professor of arts, culture, and media in the media department and is a frequent presenter on jazz, and he's very involved with civic engagement and interracial dialogue. We're so glad that Wayne is here, not only for this talk today, but will play a very important role for our conference tomorrow. So welcome. We look forward to a wonderful discussion. Wayne, it's all yours.
Thank you. I'm not sure this is on, is it? Is this microphone on? I did not see an on-off button. You guys can hear me? Such an important. Oh. The role of, I'm not a performer, as you'll see. But I was raised in a Southern Black Baptist tradition. Open mic is typically a dangerous thing. I'm your moderator today, and my role is to stay out of their way. So I'm just going to say a couple of words. We have the role of arts and artists today in helping us explore issues, how we live, work, and play with one another. Critically important. I'll chime in later during our conversation, but I want to get right to this because we've got just an amazing group of young men here to share with us some ideas and some thoughts. I get to say that. And we're gonna, each one of them is first gonna talk for a couple of minutes, presenting material. And we're gonna start with Darius Brubeck, the eldest son of Dave Brubeck. He is a pianist, composer, band leader, and an educator of note. He started the first school on the continent of Africa.
Correct.
Dedicated
That's a big claim, isn't
That
it?
is a huge claim. When I come back to you, I'm just going to tell people who the other two are, and then we'll start with you. Next to him is my friend, Larry Blumenfeld, who happens to be one of the great writers covering the music we call jazz today. His bio in the program, but he's associated with the Wall Street Journal, which we do not hold against him, by the way. He's not an economist. I had to slip a dig in on that. But he is a thought leader, a thinker. He's been covering this music since he was apparently a child. And his knowledge of and commitment to understanding and illuminating this music is surpassed only by his love of basketball, actually. And at the corner there is the maestro, one of the giants of our time. It's important to recognize these folks while they're still young. Arturo O'Farrell is the leader of Latin jazz right now. He is obviously from jazz royalty, but he is a composer, an arranger, a thinker, a band leader, so creative, always composing, which we're going to talk a little bit about. I consider him a dear friend, and he has written a piece for today's performance that is also going to flow very nicely into the centerpiece of our day today and tomorrow, Gates of Justice by Dave Brubeck. But first, let me turn it over to Darius. Each one of you will just take 10 minutes or so. I'll play timekeeper on this.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Wayne. Fortunately, before coming here, I wrote down what I called talking points because I get a little bit nervous, just on mic and expected to say something. But I didn't really expect it to go this way. But I think there are some talking points I'd like to get across. I think a very important one, which may not be obvious to this audience, is that the reason Chris, Dan, and I are here is because we were asked. That's different from being on tour, and this is one of the stops, and it's great to have this gig, and I'd be grateful for it under any circumstances. But the fact that we were asked meant that there was an intention to revive this piece and to bring this to life and to update it. It's an honor to be launching music and justice. I feel that's, of course, that's what it's all about. I also realize that there are a couple of inherent problems that won't get in the way of the performance. But one is probably the people who need to hear what we're going to talk about and hear the music. There's almost no chance that one saw a red Make America Great Again baseball cap in the ticket line. So I think we would waste a lot of time preaching to the choir, as the saying goes. But I do want to, in this opening statement, say a couple of observations about the piece, and then rhetorically ask myself, why are we here now, besides the fact that we were asked? What is the relevance of a piece that was specifically commissioned as, you know, the film was good on the background. Are we nostalgic about the civil rights era? I would say, in a way, yes, because there was an achievable goal. There was moral clarity. At the end of the day, the law was on our side. And, you know, there was, okay, there was pushback. There was a certain amount of danger, just enough. And yet, there was real certainty that the goal was achievable in a narrower sense. It was Dr. King who actually, as early as 1967, was saying, no, it's not quite what you think. It's not quite registering voters in Mississippi, which I personally was involved with. So I'm a messenger from the 20th century. I've come to you through the time machine of music. He spotted the intersection with the Vietnam War, and we could all branch out from there and find more and more things. And if we isolate each one as a problem, there's no solution. But if we see things holistically, seeing the situation of migrants at our southern borders as being part and parcel of an overall human rights concern, then we are making progress. And that is why bringing this piece alive again isn't simply to revisit a previous era, but to reawaken the impulses that drove that particular struggle. So the goals of Gates are still relevant in so many ways. There's voter suppression, police violence, mainly targeting blacks, the treatment of migrants, the rampant economic inequality throughout society that is growing, the widening gap between rich and poor and even rich and middle-class people, the disasters caused by reluctance to really tackle climate change, and one can't but see the gates of justice closing, perhaps forever. Dave's specific focus in 1969 was on civil rights, but as I've already said, if you look overall, it's not just one thing. It's not just about registering voters or abolishing separate but equal, very specific claims. And the piece itself is something like the words I'm speaking. There's a lot of complexity to the musical architecture, but there's a lot of simplicity. And you know, working on the piece, I realized kind of the brilliance of that, because actually ethics are simple. Politics is difficult, but let's not confuse the two. And the piece, the overall architecture of it is very sophisticated. It employs a variety of techniques, including serial tone rows and fugue, all of the formal devices that one associates with Western European composition. But learning to improvise on it, and this is the only way I would have learned this, I found out I only needed to know about 4 scales. 3 Hebrew scales and the blues scale, and I could nail it. So that's all from me.
Good afternoon. I'm Larry Blumenfeld. It's an honor to be here. You know, some people might say, oh, you're a cultural reporter, you're a music critic. Those words, music and justice, that's basically the storyline I've been pursuing for 30 years. And it's an honor to be around not just great artists, but great minds who want to consider what culture is and what it means. I'm a writer, so I've got a lot of words here. I should start with Dave Brubeck's words. The last time I interviewed Dave Brubeck in 2004, it was in connection with a presentation of Gates of Justice. And he told me stories about how Rabbi Charles Mintz had commissioned this Jewish cantata in connection with the dedication of a temple in Cincinnati, Ohio. He told me about the challenges of combining different musical elements, combining Old Testament texts with Martin Luther King's speeches, which Iola, his wife, was instrumental in doing. He told me about combining cantorial singing in a tenor voice with a black baritone whose style was drawn from Negro spirituals. And he was excited. He was like, it was thrilling to realize the similarities between the Hebrew chant and the spiritual and the blues. And then I asked him then in 2004 what his hopes were, what his expectations were about how this piece from '69 would be received. And he's like, we'll see. And then he waited a beat and he said, you know, when Dr. King said we must live together as brothers, people didn't hear it. Now they damn well better hear it. In this piece, Gates of Justice, in my piece, that's what I'm talking about. And I'm pretty sure if Dave Brubeck were sitting here with us now, that's what he'd say again. By the time Brubeck wrote Gates of Justice, Martin Luther King was dead, as were other key figures in the civil rights movement. It was an especially divisive moment, and among the things it threatened to tear apart were the Jewish and black communities who had a historic bond. Brubeck, who is neither Jewish nor black, was sort of ideally positioned or prepared to do something about that. Because he was such a seeker in terms of musical, moral, and spiritual matters. And as Darius alluded to, we now find ourselves in another especially divisive moment in which racism and anti-Semitism are newly weaponized, and a lot of things can get torn apart again. Brubeck's Gates of Justice and all that will unfold in the next day or two, including a piece by Arturo, speak to what binds people of all faiths, what builds understanding. And for me, it reflects my own specific faith, my faith in music as a singular force and a singular messenger, and my faith in a sense of culture as something we invest in that lends context to our similarities, our differences, and the way we might live. We know Dave Brubeck as a jazz master. Long before he composed Gates of Justice, he had achieved a level of fame few American musicians could aspire to. Throughout his career and his life, he had a commitment to social justice and had commentary about it. At the height of his popularity, he canceled an extremely lucrative tour of college campuses because the promoters objected to his black bassist, Eugene Wright. It cost him a great deal of money. It made a lot of headlines. People understood what was going on. The musical he created years earlier in collaboration with Iola, The Real Ambassadors, was a singular and powerful statement highlighting the hypocrisy of our State Department sending musicians like Dave Brubeck and Louis Armstrong abroad in the face of racism at home and injustice at home. This was a brilliant piece that not enough attention is paid to. First of all, it cast Louis Armstrong not as the caricature he was in every other movie and musical, but as who he really was, a strong black man speaking his truth. And Brubeck told me it was a satirical show. He said, through laughing at such a sad situation as segregation, we bring it down. So he was a jazz master, he was an activist. I want to also suggest him as an avant-garde artist. Not in the lazy way that term is often thrown around, meaning just about anything these days, but in its real meaning, its true meaning, an advanced guard looking ahead, invigorating and questioning the status quo, agitating for change. Now musically, what you'll hear in '69 was actually quite radical, and even today, I'd argue, is quite radical. And just as Martin Luther King did, Brubeck was making a bold argument for political change based on moral and spiritual principles. The shofar is just about the first thing you'll hear in the piece, And it's what I heard as a boy growing up during the Jewish high holidays. In his original program note, Brubeck explained that the shofar is both a call to battle and a call to conscience. And what he meant was a battle for humanity and a conscience in the face of such injustice. One thing I love about this piece is it reminds us, it's sometimes something we lose in the historical chronicle, that Martin Luther King was a Baptist minister, a man of God and faith. Also, that his call to conscience in battle relied on a cadence and a musicality that has to do with a deep black tradition that underpinned even the music that Dave Brubeck became famous playing. There's also the influence of Judaism. The man that you're named for, Darius was Dave Brubeck's first and strongest mentor when he studied music at Mills College. Now, Dave Brubeck gained a lot of things from that influence, a love of polytonality, a grand ambition, but also a lack of pretense that Darius insisted on. Miod was teaching at Mills College in California because he and his family had fled France during the German occupation, fled anti-Semitic terrorism. And I remember Dave Brubeck telling me a really poignant story about driving Miod to the 1947 premiere of a piece that Miod had written, which was an oratorio involving cantorial singing. Now, Brubeck made a major shift away from the focus on jazz around the time he composed this piece. And it was really to compose classically oriented, larger pieces, all having spiritual and moral dimension to them. And he told the Washington Post reporter in '69, "I think I can reach more people with what's important now at this time in my life and at this time in this country's history through this medium." So it was a musical ambition, but it was much more. Now, why am I here? I'm here to connect to a Jewish faith that I was raised in but I no longer practice, and connect them with black traditions that I have not lived but have studied and written about throughout my adult life, and how those things manifest in this clear faith in culture as illuminating even our darkest places, and that binds us in the face of division. When I was a boy in the Canarsie section of Brooklyn, I had relatives and family friends who would roll up their sleeves and show me the numbers burned into their arms and tell me stories about the Holocaust and people they'd lost. Around that same time, I saw firsthand the racism faced by my junior high classmates who'd been bussed into my neighborhood. And I didn't understand what was going on, but I sensed that it was deeply wrong. Brubeck, I told you, he was really moved by this connection between cantorial singing and blues and spirituals. I had my own awakening, literally an awakening. I was in Morocco on assignment. It was 3 a.m. The muezzin call came in. I woke up, but I wasn't really awake. And I heard this thing, and I heard the vocal embellishments, I heard the scales that you were talking about, and I thought of the Sephardic cantor in my temple when I was a boy. I also heard what I love about Aretha Franklin singing. I also heard some certain things about John Coltrane in his extended improvisations. Now, at that time, this is about the same time that I interviewed Brubeck, I was in Morocco. I was on assignment covering a sacred music festival, one element of which had a Palestinian and an Israeli musician working together in an orchestra. And that divide was violent then, it's violent today and yesterday. And this Palestinian musician told me, we need spiritual activists. I want to reach people at that level that CNN and Fox cannot touch, a level that exists before and after thought. So I'm really grateful to the Milken Center and everyone here for attempting to supporting the kind of spiritual activists that Brubeck was, that Darius Brubeck is, that Arturo is, and for inviting someone like me who practices journalism and criticism into this conversation. So when I talked to Mark Kligman months and months ago about this whole thing, I asked him, what do you hope happens? And he said, I want to be that lightning rod, that spark for a very important conversation. And that's what Dave Brubeck was talking about. And that's what we're starting here, I hope. So I'm honored to be a part of it.
Actually, Larry's a bit of a co-conspirator with me. We've organized several concerts, and especially one before the previous administration that was radicals against what were we trying to do? What was it called?
Oh, God.
Jazz against fascism. Yeah. Jazz against fascism. Yesterday, by the way, I don't know how many of you noticed this was a day of anti-Semitism. I don't know if any of you read that. It was yesterday. It's the day of anti-Semitism. I want to tell you something. This is real. This stuff is real. This happened to me in the middle of the last administration. I was playing at Birdland, and I was just leading the band. I was doing my gig, and I turn around and I say to the audience, well, this next song that we're going to play for you is really beautiful. It's called Llegará, 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 which means we will get there, we will get there, we will get there. And I said, and it's good that this happens. This song gives me hope because of what's coming out of Washington. And somebody stood up and used an expletive and said, you can't talk like that. You're a jazz musician. And somebody from the bar started saying, oh, he can do what he wants. This is a Birdland, this is a jazz club. Let them have their freedom of speech. And all of a sudden I'm a band leader for many years. So I snap into attention and get the musicians playing quickly. While this is happening, the party at the table that started saying I couldn't have an opinion, and the party at the bar, which said I could, started coming closer and closer together and started having words, really loud words that I could hear over the bandstand. Eventually, Johnny, the owner, and James, the bartender, kicked the offending party out. And I went over to Johnny, and I remember saying, Johnny, thank you, man, for you having our back. He said, Arturo, go into the dressing room. Those people are outside giving the Heil Hitler signal on 44th Street and 8th Avenue. This just years ago. On 44th Street in Times Square, this kind of activity was taking place. I made a transition from somebody who wanted to play like Herbie Hancock to realizing that the only thing I can do is be a truth teller with my art, with my teaching, with the music that I write. And a very sharp change took place in my life, and I remember when it took place. It took place when I wrote a piece of music called The Offense of the Drum. And The Offense of the Drum was written to counteract the actions of Rudy Giuliani, who was responsible for much of the gentrification of New York City. And I wrote this piece because he was arresting drummers. He was arresting the drummers in Central Park and in Marcus Garvey Park and taking away their drums. And I thought to myself, this is ludicrous. This is New York City. I grew up listening to drum circles. And it was really the first piece of political music that I wrote. But it really felt good to marry my conviction with my art. I mean, I can point to Dave Brubeck, Gates of Justice, or Charles Mingus, Fables of Faubus, railing against the Governor Faubus, inflicting the people for insisting on segregation in Arkansas. And there's an example after example after example after example of, yes, musicians have a duty, a responsibility to respond, to tell the truth, to tell what's going on in their day and age. And I mean, I wrote a cantata as well called Still Small Voice. And the Still Small Voice, by the way, was during the banking crisis, when ravenous bankers decided to sell junk bonds and steal, and then people lost their houses all over the world. Some people died. And I thought, where is the conscience? So I took 4 verses from different faiths and I brought them together in a cantata called A Still Small Voice, about how each one of us has a voice inside of us that tells us what to do, and either you listen to that voice or you desensitize yourself to this voice. That you will have the sovereignty and you have the agency to either listen to that voice or to desensitize yourself to it. And thank God for Dave Brubeck, and thank God for Charles Mingus, and thank God for Cornel West, who together we did a piece called 4 Questions. We did it last year here with the UCLA Philharmonia and the UCLA Afro-Latin Jazz Orchestra. And every time that I get the opportunity to write a piece of music like the piece of music that I wrote for this event, I Dream a World, based on the words of Langston Hughes, every time I get a chance, and I get a chance to tell my students, do your art from your heart. Do your art from your conviction. do it from what you really are, what you really believe, then I think that's the biggest privilege a person can have.
Beautiful. We're not gonna lose this passion. We're gonna come back. We are gonna lose Darius at some point. We've got him for a little while. How is it for you and for your brothers revisiting your father's piece? You talked a little bit about the differences you see in that time now and today, but obviously these issues are still with us. How is it for you, and how do you think your father would feel about this?
Well, I think he'd be very proud that we're doing it. At the same time, on a different level of consciousness, probably disappointed that it's so relevant. That's the brutal. Well, another brutal truth is I believe my parents were, if you are accountable, then you also earn rewards, and I think they were rewarded by being allowed to die before 2016. It's really that stark. So on their watch, they went from, as Larry referred to, concerts being canceled because Eugene Wright was in the group, to being presented a Kennedy Center medal personally by Barack Obama. And so from their point of view, there was a trajectory. So I don't know. I've upset myself trying to answer your question.
Well, as a time traveler, that happens.
Yeah.
But it's important also, I think, I was listening to Mr. Brubeck, and he thought things were falling apart. And I often think about W.B. Du Bois and others when they started the NAACP at the turn of the 20th century, very early. They started a magazine, and I used to tell my students, they didn't call it "Things Are Really Bad, but It's Gonna Suck in 2016."
Yeah.
They didn't call the magazine, "Oh my God, it's bad, but you have no idea." They called it Crisis Magazine. These problems are with us. And I think I feel grateful, actually, that the piece was written, that there are artists who stepped up, and that you and others are still carrying this torch. I feel encouraged, actually.
Yeah. Look, every cloud has a silver lining, right, as the saying goes. And to get to some practical matters, Chris and Dan have done the piece before. Obviously, I haven't, because I'm the piano player, right? So, if it's Dave's piece, you can see the logic of that. So,
he's been emoting, waiting in the wings.
Yeah. And I was a little resistant to doing that because I thought, well, if I'm doing this as a replacement, it would be rather a poor replacement in a way, considering all that Dave was. But
perhaps very appropriate.
But then I began to feel very differently about it as I studied it more and more, and realized that we could update certain sections, which is something he was always in favor of. Sometimes he would be in situations where he would hear a new version of, I don't know, In Your Own Sweet Way or something like that, and musician colleagues would say, "Oh, listen to how these kids are messing with your piece." And he would say, "No, isn't that great?" That his musical style was something that could be revised, and that, and he was so open to. I remember that he listened to young pianists whenever he could, and he was the first person to tell me about Chick Corea when I was still a student. He made a point of checking out Marcus Roberts when he was a new guy. He helped Eldar Jangarov settle in the U.S. I've gotten off the subject of me, but I think other people are more interesting sometimes, but my my feeling about doing the piece is, since we need to do it now, we'll play it our way, and now I'm 100% into it.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful.
Okay.
And you have updated it. You have made it relevant by including artists like Arturo and building all of this programming around it. Yeah, you haven't heard it, but it's still part of that milieu that we're going to experience as audience members. Talk a little bit about this. You have the rare vantage point of being a person who interviewed Dave Brubeck, but you've been an observer of the jazz scene for a couple of decades, and also the social, political, economic scene. Talk a little bit about artists and their impact and their role and the potential of this piece. There is a bit of naivete, I find, sometimes when I look back at the civil rights movement and what people say. If you actually read Brown v. Board of Education, and you read editorials around the country, I grew up in the South, you read editorials with black newspapers, folks really thought, that everything will be okay in maybe 10 years. 10 years from now, the schools will be completely integrated. And I think they were a little naive, but I think you need that naivete to believe that something's possible, and I think that artists help us when logic fails. Artists help us believe, they help us move from what is to what can be. I mean, what do you think about that as an observer of this scene?
I have a lot of complicated thoughts about the issues you're raising. I do want to mention for a moment, beyond the music that Arturo O'Farrell makes, beyond the music that Darius Brubeck makes, if you look at what they are, the context for their music, what Darius has done over decades in South Africa, in a country who holds jazz artists, Umasakela, Abdullah Ibrahim, as warriors and heroes of their country. And what Arturo has done in building a multicultural organization and orchestra that explodes or gets rid of the little ghettos we create when we say terms like Latin jazz. So I'm just pointing that out because I'm honored to be among it. Jazz is an important tradition and an important word, but if you talk to musicians, if you read the things Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, everyone up to Nicholas Payton have said, it's anything from a slave name to a marketing term. It's problematized, as they say in the academy. But let's put that aside, because what we're really talking about is music, and American, whatever we might mean by American music. And if you really invest in a term like American music, you're forced to put your guard down and think about multicultural, to acknowledge multiculturalism, not as an idea, but as a beautiful reality that's in your face. And, when you write about jazz, you encountered this. Wayne leads a very important artistic institution devoted to jazz. We encounter this all the time. Hey, let's talk about lineages in terms of styles. Can you swing like Lester Young? Can you innovate like, can you play mid-60s post-bop like Miles Davis? But what about the deeper lineages of purpose and intent? Arturo O'Farrell is the son of a great composer, musician, Chico O'Farrell. He has his own music and his own career, but he carries on the best ideals of what his father did. Darius Brubeck is the son of Dave Brubeck. The music you make doesn't sound the same when you're making your own music, but you carry on the best ideals. It's think beyond style. So there was this moment, I had a moment in 2016 too, and I don't want to talk about politics here, but and it was called Musicians Against Fascism. And we called it that because at that moment in time, we thought it was an important F word to put out there. And people were avoiding it. We thought it needed to be put out there. But I remember I was in those marches that happened after that election. And I found myself in streets with a lot of people saying a lot of valuable things, but I found myself questioning, well, what are we fighting for? What are we arguing for? What are our missions? And I want to suggest to you that one mission we can all come together around as a popular front is a real, true idea of culture in this country as not arts as something nice to have in education, not arts as a nice way to get adults to stop fighting and play nice, but culture as really reflecting who we are, what we think, what we feel, and like that person I quoted, diffusing what you see, the arguments on Sunday morning TV, getting way beyond the arguments on Facebook. I will tell you that I think we need to be warriors for this idea of culture, as elemental to, you cannot enter a voting booth intelligently if you do not understand your nation's culture and have an idea of what culture is, what it's for, and become the kind of person that Dave Brubeck wanted to make by having you in the audience for that piece. And I think that's something we can fight together for. So that's kind of my complicated answer to that question. And jazz is just one strand of, if you truly understand what jazz musicians do, the level of empathy that's necessary to be in a jazz group, then you'll see beyond what the music sounds like, what it means for what troubles us in this country. It's not about liking the other person. It's more about knowing how to actually exist with them in a meaningful and productive way that can be beautiful and that can move forward.
Yeah. I see the wheels turning, but while they're turning, I'm gonna.
I know that look too.
Yes, absolutely. He's inevitably composing something at the same time. He said, Larry, you threw out a couple of things. At first, it wasn't so complicated. Actually, you're really talking about the centrality of the role of artists, the artists as citizens, and citizens, if not as artists, having a better understanding and competence with respect to the arts, understanding the important role of the arts, not as an add-on, but making sure that we have artists, I think, at the same table as policymakers and engineers. What does it mean to build a bridge with love? I don't know, but artists are going to help the engineers think about that, right? But one key word you said was empathy. And I feel like you made it a little cold because, to me anyway, it felt like you said just so we could sort of exist together. But what I see with musicians who are practitioners of this art form called jazz, the empathy has to do with them identifying and connecting to the humanity one to another. That it's very unique. The level of practice, the diligence it takes is sort of in the background. It's a means to an end. It's not the end. But you need to have all of that. You have to have an ego, because it takes ego to get up on stage and expect people to sit out there and like it and perhaps pay money for it. But at the same time, you have to have humility. You have to step back and let others shine. You have to listen. You don't know. You're not just playing a G major 7. That G major 7 is going to sound differently when you're playing with Mr. Brubeck. I'm looking at you, Arturo. So now, you've been very intentional as a composer. Talk about that in the context of empathy and connection and intentionality, what you're trying to have us all experience through your music.
Wow, that's, I think we're living in a real dangerous time period, and I think we're not really fully conscious of how scary it is for some of the things that are being said in the public arena and getting away with it. I think we've gone backwards before civil rights. I think we're in such an area of danger that I think we have to act with great speed and clarity in what we do as artists. This is not fun. This is not a fun era to live in. This is a terrifying time to be young. This is a terrifying time to see the level of hatred. And some of it, I have to say, and may not go over so well, I'm kind of a revolutionary and an anarchist, so please don't hate me if I say some of it has to do with the structures in our socioeconomic system. We're living in what feels like the paralyzing death throes of capitalism. And I'm sorry, I know that some people will disagree, but we can't continue in this system where we manufacture worker bees and then take away even that, where there are people living under the 405, entire families, villages living under the 405. We can't do that anymore. We can't have that anymore. The anger is palatable. The situation that we find ourselves in is creating the hatred at the governmental level, at the social level, and at every level that you can imagine. So artists, what is your response to this? speak hard truth. Speak hard truths. I don't get invited to certain festivals. I don't get invited to certain jazz clubs. I don't get invited to certain magazines, and I don't care. Because my job is to care about my people, building community, building pueblo, building places. I'm actually building a building. The Afro-Latin Jazz Alliance is building a community performing arts center in Spanish Harlem. Doing the work, putting the plowshare to the field, going out. I had a student from here call me at 3 o'clock in the morning in a panic, and I didn't get it, but the next day I responded. He said, what's wrong? He says, I want to use my music to battle climate change. But my heart went out to him. I said, go find a young person to teach saxophone, to go to a nursing home, play, volunteer, do whatever you can locally. We're in a dangerous place. And so every time, very much with intentionality, do I create music that I think is a plea for us to wake up before it's too late.
I certainly applaud everything that you're saying, and I agree with it, but I'd also like to widen it a little bit or just take it from a different perspective. Because, okay, not everyone is equally well exposed to the information that you're talking about or has the analytical tools. And one can get into pointless arguments, pointless because they're simply statements of positions that can't meet. And even the sort of direct physical, practical activism, which I think is great, isn't appropriate for everybody. It doesn't fit everyone's circumstances. But then that doesn't mean nothing is possible. And I'll give you a South African perspective, for instance, was, it's no longer the case now, of course, but there was heavy censorship. And you really, you could get busted for songs that were perceived as freedom songs, as revolutionary songs, and so forth. But instrumental music, which everyone just understood as a sort of code, you mentioned Hugh and Abdullah and many others, a man I played with very often, Winston Mankunku and Ngozi, had a hit record. I mean, you know, it was like Take 5 in South Africa called Yakal Nkomo, which just means the bellowing bull or the cry of the cow, different translations into English. And you say, well, you know, what's revolutionary about that? Well, if you're you know, part of the apartheid establishment, you're not very keyed into African culture, and you don't realize that cattle are a metaphor for the population, right, for the general people, and that a person's greatest obligation is to take care of the cattle and not upset them, and you know, so the there were all sorts of soft ways. That's what I'm getting to about your point. It isn't, you're not necessarily confronting the situation directly, but you can be subverting it. Another thing that I experienced a lot was playing in places where white and black musicians and audiences weren't supposed to be together. And the way you overcame that was just by ignoring it. Now, it usually worked. Now, I had a gimmick, which is a broad American accent if I want one. And so I just don't know. And, you know, I'm breaking the law and sorry, but, you know, but we're all set up. Why don't we play anyway? You know, so you kind of, you can go that route. And then also, and this is something in a very different kind of situation that happened in Eastern Europe and in a different way in South Africa, is that you would have a situation where jazz tended to bring people together in a way that they would start to establish networks of trust that just by being in the audience together, never mind being on stage together, you would begin to see some of the same white people coming to black rallies. You would see some of the black people in jazz clubs, becoming more socially open with white people rather than suspecting their motives for being there. So, I don't want to ramble on and on, but sometimes it can be a way of not directly confronting, but of softening up differences, of blending cultures, of showing people that things that they might have been afraid of are all right, and they're not going to lose respect and dignity or become disenfranchised by just opening their hearts to others. So that's not in any way rebuttal to your point. I think it's more widening it, that the intentionality can be welcoming as well as confrontational.
I would say actually amplifying my point, because I don't write lyrics. I don't engage in lyric writing, but I think the topics that I tackle are meant to create awareness of these things in a very, very substantial way. And also just the other thing too is that you have to take action. I think though the thing I would say is that we can't ignore people living under the 405. We can't ignore the growing number of homeless people it's just cataclysmic. So now I can't write something that's gonna fix that. I'm not, but I can write something that makes people aware of the fact that it's getting worse.
But that is precisely, I think, the role of the artist. It's not, I don't believe in trying to turn artists into policymakers, but your music and writing, and you have spoken word artists working with you, Dr. West, the role of a shaman in the piece I saw at the Apollo, I've forgotten the name. But what that does is, I like to have my cake and eat it too. Right? So I don't mind the soft approach. Music allows that, and you need that. Dr. King was considered a radical until Malcolm X came along. And suddenly, 35 years later, he's got a national holiday. I grew up in the South, as I told you. I have friends who are, far right Trump cats, And they swear that, Dr. King now he's biracial. In 20 years, he's going to be white. These things happen. Wish I were kidding. They totally say he's a Republican now. And I said, I wish we had I know. Yes,
I am in my private life quite political, but I want to actually steer us a little bit away from straight up politics. And I know exactly what you mean when you say this is a point, it can get into a pointless conversation. And I think what you mean is intractable.
Yeah.
It's intractable, and it is in so much of our
Seemingly
lives.
intractable.
Well, my experience is if you spend enough time on social media, if you spend enough time watching and listening to political shows, I would say actually intractable at this point.
But you're sitting next to a man who lived in apartheid South Africa.
Well,
This was impossible.
But my point is wherever the politics reside, whatever they are, soft, hard, I'm suggesting that my experience with great artists, great musicians, great figures of jazz, great figures of what we call creative music, that there is inherently, it's so sophisticated and so lived that it is inherently spiritual and inherently political and inherently tied to a sense of humanity that gets around that intractable stuff. I think one of the brilliant things about these couple of days or so here and the Milken Center in UCLA, 2 C words, community and context. There's a lot of great music, there are a lot of great artists, but there is a situation now in terms of the alienation of digital life, and there is a situation now in terms of what I would position as the possible death of journalism and the possible death of criticism, and those are my professions. I'm okay, but I don't know about the 28-year-old who wants to do these things. That context, what you experience here is vital context, and it is not someone's fault if they don't have access. In South Africa, there's a very stark example of erasure of history. There are erasures of history that happen in this country. Like, for instance, when Arturo brings up Rudy Giuliani arresting drummers, it's important that people understand the fact that enslaved Africans had their drums taken away throughout much of this hemisphere, and not so much in New Orleans during a little period when the French were in charge. And that's why New Orleans, that is one distinguishing feature of New Orleans, but there is a context and a history there. I am deeply troubled, not about my own work, but I am deeply troubled about the larger idea that, yes, journalism and criticism aren't there to tell you whether Dave Brubeck's Gates of Justice is good, but it's there to help you understand why he wrote it, what was the history of it, what happened when it was performed, what it might mean today. So I think this is an important quality to bring to younger audiences and to schools and to places of higher education. And
isn't it a form of criticism, Larry? Isn't this also journalism, community journalism in a way?
Oh, no, absolutely. To me, this is all part of building context. And I mean, my role in writing is not so much to tell you, it's to engage in a, I have the luxury of being in print, but hopefully I'm stimulating a conversation. And we have seen in the past 8 or so years what happens to our political discourse when journalism as we knew it just doesn't exist the same way anymore. There will be a lot of erasure of, I give you tiny little examples like, hey, I wrote liner notes to someone's album, and when you download the track, you will not get that story, which is just a commercial consideration. But that's a tiny example. So yeah, to me, this is exactly. This is community, this is context, and this is community. And I think it's something also to keep in mind and fight for. And you know what? If you have that, you don't need to worry so much about where that other person stands.
Yeah.
You know?
As a time traveler from the 20th century, no, I don't have yet another big speech to make, but I just want to pick up on a couple of small things. I think we give too much prominence to politics, either formal or informal. Whereas culture is really important. I'll give you a little example from my life, and it's so ironic and funny, but being in California reminds me that I grew up in Oakland before the family moved to the East Coast, and I went to, and here's a way where society has gone backwards, I think. Now I'm talking about the Eisenhower administration, the Korean War is on, I'm going into a school. As I enter the school, which was right across the street from the rented house we were in, there's a sign handwritten by kids that says, "In California, hablamos español." I don't know, but I don't think you'd see that sign today because that's so accepting. And I'll tell you what else. I never met a Mexican in that school. There was probably informal real estate segregation and so forth, but nevertheless, the idea was there are different languages spoken here. Get used to it. Our little book of local history, written in English, but I remember this because I had to struggle with it, and then I felt proud that I could understand it. Local history was Tierra de Ensenada. That's the history of Oakland. And I don't think people are getting that in school anymore, but that's the importance of culture. So I grew up thinking, well, I'm kind of a co-citizen with people who speak a different language, I should learn that language at least on a casual basis as far as possible.
And yet at the same time, I lived in Brooklyn for a long time. The corner stores aren't corner stores, they're bodegas. Typically run by folks from the Middle East, but who call them bodegas in Arabic. Everybody knows this. It's been 30 years since salsa passed ketchup as the #1 condiment in the U.S.
Yeah.
So we should be, like 30 years. Corporate America knows this. We have to talk about something as American as a burrito and arroz con pollo.
The very last, actually, that last interview I did with your father, he had finally relented to record companies that wanted him to do a Christmas holiday album.
Yeah,
and
which is great, yeah.
what he was excited about, I don't remember the tradition, but he was excited about this Mexican tradition.
La Fiesta de la Posada.
Right, which was central to that album.
Yeah.
I mean, he had converted to Catholicism.
Yeah.
That was represented, but that's what he was excited about on that album.
By the way, I just want to raise one other thing that I've been wanting to raise. It's also about the idea that that jazz is an American art form. Jazz is an inheritance of a devastating event called the slavery trade, and that same devastating part of history. And when you don't understand slavery, you can't understand jazz. And I also want to say that same those same elements that brought this incredible, graceful truth to us also landed in Mexico and in Cuba and in Peru and in Colombia. And so this thing we call jazz is actually an incredibly rich migrant force that I think we need to really start thinking about in a larger, more global context as the legacy of a hateful, hateful thing called slavery. But I did want to share one thing with Larry, if I could. If it wasn't for liner notes, I wouldn't be a musician today. This is a true story. My mother and father used to lock the record collection. I thought maybe they kept their stash there. I don't know. But being 12 years old, I broke into their record collection and pulled out the first record I could see, and it was Miles Davis's Greatest Hits. And the liner notes were by George Fraser, who was the style and editor for the Esquire magazine.
Warlord
I'll never
of
forget.
the Regions.
The Warlord of the Regions, exactly. And the first words are, I don't mean to be a bastard about this, but I simply cannot tolerate a man who doesn't dress well. And then he goes on for the entire length of the thing, talking about how great Miles Davis dresses for the entire length of the liner notes. The very last paragraph, he goes, by the way, people who know tell me that he plays the trumpet and that he's quite good. I had to listen to that record. That's how I became a musician. The first notes of Ron Carter and Seven Steps to Heaven and Tony Williams and Herbie Hancock changed my life, but I would not have done it if it weren't for the liner notes.
And you know, the divisiveness.
No, hang on 1 second, because we're gonna lose. we're gonna lose Darius. So let me give you a chance to have a final word, or if anyone has a burning question they have to ask of Mr. Brubeck. He's got to migrate over to Royce Hall for the performance. Any last thoughts? What do you want people to walk away with after today's performance, aside from understanding the deep humanity that you bring to your music and to this particular set of issues and this approach to those issues?
I think the music itself is supposed to carry all of that, you know, and I hope it does. And I don't know if I really have a final word, and it's not because I'm nervous about getting to set up and play. I'm loving this conversation, and maybe just to say something further about, you know, saying artists being aware of things and so forth. That was something that Dave handed down to me and Chris and Dan. Chris is a very prolific composer. He used a metaphor that would be hard to understand today, like technological things change, like saying, you know, cart before the horse and so forth. But he said an artist is like the canary in the coal mine, that they're always they're kind of living where other people are going to arrive. And that doesn't confer a kind of superiority, but it does mean a kind of sensitivity. Maybe it's not even an advantage. Maybe it means, you know, he just worried about things before other people got to worry about them too. That's one thing. And the other thing is, gosh, I endorse the point about culture. Culture is, and intellectuals might know of someone named Hannah Arendt, who warned against functionalizing culture. Culture is what carries through. It's what lasts. Don't confuse entertainment with culture. Entertainment takes place within that context.
Thank you.
We're going to continue. Pick up on that. You're a composer. You're very intentional. How does that notion of being intentional about, you're thinking about people whose lives are affected by policies that we're all under. How does that then dovetail into, or does it even, with aesthetic quality? I mean, obviously you're good, but are you thinking about, do you jettison something sometimes because it just doesn't work, even though it may make the right political or the right social statement?
I remember my father saying, if you're going to be a musician, be the very best musician you could be, and you don't have to pick sides. So whatever I do, whatever I craft, I try to craft at the highest level that I possibly can. But I wanted to pick up on something that Darius said, which I think is so beautiful, confusing entertainment with culture. I think that there's something that I also rail against, which is the elitism of culture, the elitism of arts, the elitism of how we use music and opera and orchestra and jazz and all these things to kind of keep people in separate corners, you know. And I think it's such a silly thing. If your toilet is running over, do you call a poet, a philosopher, a pianist, or a plumber? You know, I mean, to me, like, the idea that an artist is somehow elevated in stature is such nonsense. It's such complete crap. And for me, this is really important because what I learned from Son Jarocho musicians, especially, was that everyone's invited. We should have Mozart piano trios in the hood. We should be putting on operas and Watts and take it off the stages. And maybe, not necessarily dismantle the stages, but maybe we should invite people onto the stages to take part at the highest levels of making art. And so, yeah, culture is not reading. Culture is not listening to Beethoven. I'd love to play Beethoven, love to read, but culture is living. Culture is the way people are born, the way they die, the way they marry, the way they divorce, the way they eat. Culture is the thing that we all do from here to North Korea to South America. And it's really beautiful, beautiful said, because we think that we read something or watch it on TikTok that it's real. It's bullshit.
You have to comment. You brought up social media, Larry. So.
I have a 14-year-old son, so I'm very reluctant to say negative things about certain technology or social media, lest I be old and irrelevant, as he tells me that I am. And he may be correct. But, you know, there's been a little bit of talk about, you know, people are for this, against this. So here's what I'm against. And it's what I think Dave Brubeck's Gates of Justice argues against on a musical level, on a spiritual level, on a moral level, and on a political level. I'm against fundamentalism of any sort. Fundamentalism of any sort is a very dangerous thing. Now, my understanding, Dave Brubeck composed this piece very specifically, very strategically, very carefully. But if you listen to the 1970 recording of it, sounds very different than the recording the Milken Center made 30 years later or so. Sounds very different than the way you'll hear it performed later today. And that was meant to evolve that way. It was built in, as is the case with this man's music. Duke Ellington was famously interviewed on some big network station in the narrator asked him, "What's your favorite of all your pieces? What's your favorite piece?" And he said, "The next one, baby." My understanding of the United States Constitution and of what this country is really about is that it's an act of becoming. It's going to be a more perfect union. Implies that we're not yet a perfect union, that we have amendments to our Constitution. So no matter where you stand politically, I'm not sure what the word originalism means when it's applied to the Constitution. I'm not sure what these people who say, I like early Miles Davis, but not the later stuff, or I like early John Coltrane, but not the weirder, more spiritual stuff. So I think that much of when you really pay attention to artists and art and whatever we mean by culture, the message you get is fundamentalism has no place here. We are all constantly evolving, and we are all in the act of creating whatever we're creating, even just the next day. So to me, I feel like that is the political message, not who's right and who's wrong.
Yeah. Is there a space though? Because you said you were quoting people who said, I don't like. Yeah. Is it possible for those folks to prefer Kind of Blue?
Absolutely.
But understand the importance of Bitches Brew or, the Lost Quintet? Because you're talking about aesthetics now.
Yeah. No one, what you like, what you don't like, especially when it comes to music, you're going to feel it in your body. And then everything else is just elaboration. You may come to like something. There's music I listened to when I was 14, like Stevie Wonder, that I love just as much today. There's other music I listen to that I don't love as much. When my brother first played me Thelonious Monk's music and I was a teenager, what the hell is this? Now those are the things I would rescue first out of a burning building, Thelonious Monk's music. I love Henry Threadgill's music. I would not persuade someone who can't hear Henry Threadgill's music. Taste is taste, style is style, but do not discount the relevance or the value of those things. You may not choose to listen to it. So there's a whole lot of stuff that's out there that unless I actually listen to it and experience it and deal with its context, I can say, I don't like the way that sounds, but I can't dismiss it out of hand. And it's very rare that you will experience art that actually offends you on a level where you think it shouldn't exist. And frankly, if you did, that's quite an accomplishment too for an artist. Sometimes I wonder though, could instrumental music without words still affect us the way like John Coltrane's music or Nat Coleman's music or Stravinsky's Rite of Spring affected us? I wonder.
I think you have to ask a different question. Okay. It's not, can it affect us? Is there something that can affect people today that affected people during that time the way Love Supreme did? Everyone knows Giant Steps changes now. You know what I mean?
Louis Armstrong said he didn't understand Charlie Parker's music. He called it Chinese music. It's, everyone, we play the music of Duke Ellington not to replicate it, but to catch the vision that he had. We play Chico Farrell's Afro-Cuban Jazz Suite not the way he played it, because we don't want to replicate, but we want to catch a glimpse of Chico's imagination that he said, let me mix up jazz and Cuban music. We don't do these things to replicate them, and it's not museum music. But what we want to do is we want to capture the daring mind that said, let me try something new. Let me try scat singing. When he tried scat singing, people freaked out. And every time we hear, maybe somebody doesn't understand the music of the art, this is a bold stab at the Wild Wild West. A lot of art ensemble of Chicago is not taught in conservatories. Right. What kind of nonsense is that? Do we take our cues from Ken Burns and ignore an entire history of jazz? What happened to women in jazz? Where's the canon? Why is the canon the canon? Why isn't Carla Bley mentioned along Duke Ellington?
Well, but we know why. We know why. We know who who established it. Once the music moved into the academy, sorry, my University of Rutgers, sorry.
Well, that's why they have like people like me in the
That's
academy.
right. Well, but do they know?
I think
why?
they know.
Why? Well, you say we know why. Why?
Well, there were certain people who moved. There was the decision makers who moved the music into the academy, and there so much good things come out of it. This is just Wayne's little theory about this. The level of musicianship is extremely high. Music education is at a very deep level in this country right now. Junior high school kids and high school kids playing Donna Lee and swinging hard, harder than my generation did, right, at that time. But as Micaiah McCraven, this wonderful young drummer out of Chicago, said, he's probably, 35 or 40 now, he's a kid still. What does he say? We were taught how to play. We weren't taught why you play. So when the music moved into the academy and you got away from the master-apprentice model, things got codified. And the people who got to publish books and say, here are the important ones, they left out Mary Lou Williams. They forgot that Mary Lou Williams gave references for this young pianist.
Mel
He's
Balliston.
pretty good. Thelonious Monk. You should give him a break. And Mel Balliston. We just had a thing in the club, by the way.
Oh,
celebrating Mel.
I just wanted to point out one thing. I'm sorry, Larry. Do you know how I learned to play jazz? At Studio Wee, on the corner of Eldridge and Rivington, with James Du Bois, Cornelius Smith. I mean, and that there was no academy for me. And every single, and you had to beg these guys. You have to beg them. Hey, how do you play that chord, Cornelius? What is that chord? I'm not going to tell you. Come on, man. I want to know how you did that voicing. What kind of chord is that? I never heard of it. No, go get me a beer. And then like 50 times after you ask him, he's going, okay, I'll show you how to do that, but only once. You better not forget, because he wouldn't tell you again. Right. But that was the appropriation of information. And I think what's happening is and I know this, and my students are so brilliant. And they know that you can't hand them the truths on a silver platter. My students are so fierce and so hungry to really understand the behind the notes. Mm-hmm. And you don't play the page, you play the music.
That's right. Good.
I think some of what you're talking about, that codification, that narrowness, comes strictly from business and commercial interests, and which then guided a lot of what happened in the academy before, not now. And so I remember I once spoke at some class, and some graduate student reached out to me after and said, "Oh, I want to talk to you about this I'm writing a thesis about Ethiopian jazz, which is frankly a fascinating subject, and there's some great music. So I want your opinion on whether this is jazz or world music." And what I told her was, well, you should really look under the hoods of those terms and where they came from, what they mean, who came up with them. Especially world music, could you think of a more demeaning and colonialized term than world music? And I was like, when you see names and categories, it usually means that someone wanted to name it, then own it, and then sell it. That's how you do that. We are in a we've had a lot of gloom and doom here. We're in an interesting, provocative moment of opportunity because the businesses that surrounded those things are imploded. They're imploded. That creates an opportunity. Never before have artists, people who write about culture, people who teach about culture and arts, never before have we had such an open field to define. And what Arturo mentioned, the Art Ensemble of Chicago. The Art Ensemble of Chicago came out of a movement in Chicago more than 50 years ago that led to the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians. Yeah. This is a very important moment in American history. Yeah. Everyone in the United States should know what the AACM was, how powerful it is now, what great artistry came out of it, and what kind of model, not just for aesthetics, but for controlling and directing your own artistic products. To me, and very few people even know it existed.
Yeah, see, I'm actually very as cynical and bitter, just a bitter old jazz head. I'm actually very hopeful, not optimistic, I'm hopeful, but not because of the things you just said, Larry. See, I disagree with you strongly on that. I think when the community and the artists had control of the music, that's when it was. It just wasn't recognized by commerce, by the academy. We have a very different situation here that I think we're only vaguely aware of. It relates to what Darius was talking about, the civil rights movement. Part of the way a movement exists is it has to know that it's a movement. And we look back, I think our generation, I think we look back on the civil rights movement with a little bit of rose-colored glasses. A little bit. I think there was naivete. We can end discrimination ever. Now we know it didn't happen. But we've forgotten in the 70s, people were saying, look, we tried this and it didn't work, right? And let's be serious about it. I always say black folks, or African Americans, we're the problem child, right? Black folks, they're committing all the crime and making all the babies and taking all the welfare and taking all the good jobs and taking all the good spots at the elite schools. We're very busy. And taking all the slots in hospitals, right? And making music and doing all this stuff, right? That was a real conversation. Look, we've tried. By the way, you can use black folks as just a canary in the coal mine for poor people. Come to Virginia, Appalachia. Folks who've been here, I don't like calling them immigrants because I got friends who's like, Wayne, we've been here 10 generations. Y'all just showed up, 200 years ago, right? You can use that metaphor. These are folks who are left out, who haven't been able to tell their stories. I'm sorry, y'all, I'm talking too much. I want to hear these guys. But so I quibble a little bit. We have an opportunity now, but not if we don't interrogate structures like, whether it's capitalism or free market. I think more of the profit motive, because I actually like the free market when it comes to art and ideas and faith tradition and who you choose to love. I love that free market, but I want us to interrogate profit motive. So, and in that context, what is the role? Again, I'm not an artist, I get to be artist adjacent. I want to be inspired. I don't want to turn artists into policymakers, but I want you to help us, again, make that inferential step. Logic won't get us there. Logic will not get us there. It makes no sense for wealthy people to vote against their own interests, right? But heart and empathy. If I want the best for someone else's kids that I want for mine, that's going to change what I do. I can't drive past the 405 and see families. That person, a buddy of mine said, he's kind of religious. Yeah, I'm talking too much. I'm sorry. I swear to God, it's my last story. He says, yeah, Wayne, he says, I can't wait for us to get time machines or future, and we're talking to God, and we're going to be like, you put all this bad stuff on us, climate change and cancer. And God is like, I gave you the cure to cancer. It was a little girl growing up in Cabrini Green in the projects. I gave you the cure to climate change. There was the kid who grew up in El Barrio. You didn't recognize that person. I think that's so real. There's so much talent that we haven't nurtured. So
there's absolutely so much truth to what he's talking about. The free market system is vital. I think the political discourse system is vital, and I think that it's far be it from me to not talk about conservative values versus liberal values, Democrat. It's just that it's not that simple. It's not red wine or white wine. It's not Pepsi or Coca-Cola. It's just not that simple. We've been trained. We've been taught. They're trying to train us to think that it's black or white, and it's not. And what I love about what you said, it's not about free market system. It's about examining how much profit is enough profit, and how about artists, leaders ask those questions so that all of us have the opportunity to think about why we're allowing rampant capitalism to run our policy and our governance. That's where the problems are. But I am, like you, cautiously hopeful. I wouldn't say optimistic, but I see a lot, and this is the thing, and I want to just address one more thing. In this institution, we are examining the canon. In this institution, we're having the conversations about why we call this music that, and why we call that music that, and maybe even changing the name of this or that to this or that, because we want a more open discourse. And I'm proud to be a part of UCLA.
Yes, I just want to say, if there are burning questions, I can barely see you all. I think we're running out of time. I've forgotten what he told me, but it's jazz. We have a fluid notion of temporal displacement. Go ahead, Larry, say it.
I actually don't think we're really fundamentally disagreeing.
We probably don't.
I think we're just talking a little, even though that would be more colorful. I think we're speaking in a little different terms. But no, I don't. I would not want to tell the artist, the musician, you must be political. You must be a spokesperson. What that person's part of that person's function, just by virtue of what they're doing, is to make us address our humanity and be more human, which is kind of a prerequisite to entering into civic life and political discussion. And that's what Martin Luther, I mean, to me, I'll go back to something I said about this piece. It really highlights Martin Luther King was trying to make us more human and address our humanity. And he was doing it from a spiritual source, and he was doing it with a musicality that connected to the very kind of culture you were talking about. And Dave Brubeck gave that yet another context with this piece. Now, when it comes to commerce and profit and business, it has become fashionable for people, and I think it's a good thing, hey, is there plastic in that? Hey, is that company being environmentally sound? How is that stuff sourced? Well, if you're consuming, say, music, you might want to consider, hey, is that source paying the artist even less than a record label? No, we're not gonna, I don't want to argue about the music business. I'm just saying, make the same consciousness in terms of your economy that we did about environmentalism. Hey, because people like George Lewis, great composer and artist that came out of the AACM, he has a mission to decolonize the concert hall. It's very effective. But also those people made us aware there is no contradiction between you being an artist, a pure, straight-up artist, and you also being something we might call an arts worker. And why can't we respect you as both of those things at the same time and be concerned about the working conditions that you function under? Because I don't think a lot of older guys will tell you, see what it was like in my day. It doesn't have to be that way.
It shouldn't be.
It shouldn't be that way. Supporting the arts means supporting the artist, means respecting the artist, and what you get back isn't just entertainment. What you get back is some humanity in a dehumanized world, or I don't want to be gloomy, in a world that makes it challenging to be the human you want to be. So I am optimistic. I'm optimistic because things like these 2 days can exist, and a piece like this can have not just, this piece could have been presented as nostalgia. This school could have just presented this piece, and that would have been important. That would have gotten the same coverage. But instead, it's presented as a living document where we'll hear music by living composers, and we'll think about what this means in our own lives. That, to me, is a political act. It's also a wise thing in terms of how even the business around this gets structured.
We probably should.
Yeah.
We had a concert.
Because we're going to need to move over to yes.
I got a question for Arturo. As a performing artist, do you see a change in who attends in terms of, are they moving from understanding, going because it's an entertainment commodity, to a deeper understanding? Do you sense an experience?
Yeah, I do. In our audiences, we really begin to see younger, more diverse audiences, which thrills me.
Let me stop you right there. I know people have to leave. Can we give these gentlemen a round of applause before we're going to keep talking for a moment?
I want to answer your question. Yeah, in our audiences are really getting younger and diversifying because we're diversifying on the bandstand.
Any other questions someone want to yell out?
Yeah, well, there's a point. Musicians Against Fascism concert is available online. Larry, Arturo.